All right, welcome to Just Some Guys podcast. I'm Just Some Guy. I am here with my very special guest, my best friend in the entire world. I'm just joking. I don't even know the guy, but he has an awesome book that we're going to talk about here today. And he also has a very awesome website called jaysanalysis.com. He has written two books. One we're going to talk about, Esoteric Hollywood and Esoteric Hollywood 2. He's done a show called Hollywood Decoded on Gaia TV, if I got that correct. And so thank you very much for taking your time to speak with lowly old me. Is there anything that I missed?
I don't think so. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. The only thing I can think of is that I do have a subscription service at Jay's Analysis. If people are interested, they can subscribe there. But glad to be here. Glad to talk to you. Glad you enjoyed the book, and hopefully Esoteric Hollywood 2 can live up to the expectations. So far, everybody seems to think part 2 actually tops part 1. So I know you're busy with part 1. You haven't got to part 2 yet, but that's okay. You will in time.
Yes.
So thank you for having me.
Yes. Well, thank you. Well, I guess one of the main theses of your book and of your writing about Hollywood is the connection of Hollywood with CIA, with the occult, with even the mafia, as you cover in your second book.
Right.
So can you expand a little bit? What really got you focused on that? How did you start to figure that out?
Well, I just always loved movies. I grew up as a guy who wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be in movies. I just thought that sounded fun. I know that's typical in America. Everybody kind of wants to have this Hollywood-style dream that they have, and you think it's going to be this and that. And then as you get older, you kind of get wiser to the way the world really works, that it doesn't actually operate like a movie, and people aren't always cast because they're the most talented or they're the best at what they do or this or that. But I was very active in drama team in comedy duos back in high school. We used to that was an aspect of the drama team where you could do comedy duo and improv. So had a lot of fun doing that. And my crew in high school, we were all very artsy. So we were the artsy kind of people, and we were always making skits and making videos and doing the stuff that I do now, basically. So it kind of naturally led into, when I went to college, I wanted to pick something relevant to that. I wasn't as interested in acting as I did kind of turn my attention toward philosophy. And when you're going through college, you're kind of thinking, well, how can I pick something that's going to make money that's also going to be fun at the same time? And I failed at that. I picked something that does not make money but is fun. So I had to figure out a way to make money after I did all that college nonsense. And I don't recommend people go to university unless you're going for a hard science. Then I say could be potentially useful. But long story short, in college, I got into geopolitics and conspiracy and this kind of stuff in the real world, and I started reading really in-depth historical books. I did a undergraduate in history and philosophy, and then a graduate in philosophy and literature. And I wanted a way to really tie all of those worlds together. I'm a big picture, holistic thinker kind of person, so I wanted to see the interrelationships between these seemingly disparate worlds. And eventually, I by the time I got to grad school, I was really focused on, I had several film classes that were really cool. We analyzed a lot of Oliver Stone films. We did a lot of lit and movies. Film and lit was one of my favorite classes. So it just kind of became its own natural transition. I just kind of went from taking the academic interests and trying to meld them with the artsy movie interests, and this is what came out.
I currently am reading Lily Kay's book, Molecular Vision of Life. And she actually says, she's got this chapter how in the 20s they were building up Caltech in LA. She actually has this little paragraph where she talks about, she says Southern California burst into the national arena during the 1920s, and its indigenous industries derived their might from the region's own business magnates. She says, with the exception of the motion picture industry, financed heavily by the Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan groups. This
Yes.
is such a big support of your thesis that Hollywood is not, I guess you would say, organic. That it's, I guess it's there for a reason, right? Not just entertainment.
Ultimately, yes, right. And this is kind of what I touched on early on in the first book, was that even before the big studio systems, it was kind of seen and known back in the 20s, the teens, 20s, that there was going to be the potential for social engineering with the camera. I actually go into a little more of this in the second book, where I talk about the character of Howard Hughes, his history, his relationship between what nowadays we'd call the deep state and Hollywood, and him actually making really elaborate war propaganda films that were the blockbusters of their day, right? Hell's Angels is one of the great blockbusters, and he put all of his own money into making this big blockbuster. So what we see from that, and from many other examples, like you said, Rockefellers, they particularly were involved in RKO Pictures, and then there were other studios that eventually developed, and you had different mafias. That you had the Italian mafia, you had the Jewish mafia, you had the Wasp mafia. These different mafias all had interest in these different studios. So it becomes a multi-layered engine of propaganda. And ultimately, yes, I think if you wanted to subsume it under one big umbrella, what we eventually see, especially by the time of the 40s and 50s with Laurel Canyon Studio, is that the chief utilizer of Hollywood as a propaganda edifice is the Pentagon. It is the Air Force. It is the military, especially during those wartime periods. I mean, it's just churning out nonstop wartime propaganda, and it's natural to. I mean, that's the Soviets themselves did this, right? There were a lot of Soviet filmmakers who also churned out propaganda through film, and that's just the nature of the beast. It's just the nature of the camera and what they saw it could do. And so I'm not trying to oversimplify it by saying that it was one giant conspiracy. There were multiple competing interests and powers, but ultimately, that's really what it becomes useful for is military and social engineering propaganda.
Right.
Within the blockbusters, I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's what we're going to get into when we start talking about these movies that you break down. And your research, you've shown that the Rockefeller interest, the foundation, was most of his staff eventually made up the original OSS, right? The OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, was staffed with a bunch of Wall Street guys that were working in Rockefeller anyways. So there you immediately have that marriage of Hollywood, the intelligence agencies, under the same roof of the Rockefeller Morgans. So again, your thesis is heavily supported. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say real quick, the best example of this that's even clear, I'm not saying that your examples aren't clear. I mean, you see it with Howard Hughes, and then later on with guys that are a little more obviously OSS for sure. And all of the original big TV studios, CBS, NBC, CBS, they were also originally staffed by people from the OSS. So they took all their wartime psychological warfare research, and they combined it with Walter Lippmann and PR stuff, and then they went into film and TV, and that's how they were so successful in marshaling public opinion during those decades for the wars, and then eventually for the Cold War. But the only thing I wanted to say was that the other great example of this, and the way that I kind of inadvertently stumbled on this, was through just an interest in movies, and then doing my grad work on the character of Ian Fleming, who's the guy behind James Bond. And that's probably the best, clearest example of the relationship between intelligence agencies and Hollywood, is just the character of Ian Fleming himself, because he was a high-level black ops guy.
Sorry if you can hear that. Someone's stomping around upstairs. Yes.
I hear it. The boomers do it here. I have to deal with it all the time, too.
So also, when I was reading Renee Wormser's Foundation and Their Powers, he actually said the infamous Alder Hiss, while he was the president of the Carnegie Foundation, actually suggested using movies to educate the public on world affairs.
Sure.
So again, and I think I tweeted at you about that, like, did you ever find direct involvement of the foundations other than through the CIA in funding movies with specific propaganda? And I think you kind of already answered that question there.
It becomes more pronounced later on, but I would say during the wartime period, it was less pronounced through the foundations. So, like, I typically point to examples like if you look at the old Twilight Zone, you'll find that a lot of the consultation that was going on with Twilight Zone was through Department of Defense, and it'll actually be in the credits of a lot of the episodes of Twilight Zone. Not every one, but a lot of the military ones, really heavily military. You'll see made in consultation with the Department of Defense. So it was actually during the wartime periods, ironically, it was a little more transparent that it was being used for military purposes. Now, there were people that were experimenting even back then with product placement, but it's actually by the time of Bond is when product placement really becomes fashionable and successful as an experiment with James Bond promoting different vodkas and Aston Martins and Walter PK guns and this kind of stuff. Yeah. And there's actually interviews with Sean Connery back then talking about, this really kicking off product placement in a successful way. But with foundations themselves, you're right that there have been interconnectedness, but I would say that it's a little more transparent as we get closer into the Cold War. Because the role of NGOs and foundations, even though there have always been these private foundations for a long time, they take on more prominence as we move to after World War II.
Right. Let's start getting into the book here. The first part, you cover a lot of Kubrick. Eyes Wide Shut, The Shining, 2001. Part 2 is my favorite part. You really start taking down H.G. Wells. And then you get into Spielberg with E.T., Close Encounters, AI, Minority Report. Part 3 is your 70s and 80s dystopia movies. Part 4 is when you really get into 007 and Hitchcock. And then you have your conclusion. Altogether, you get 24 chapters, a lot of movies. We're not going to cover every single one of them because we don't have all night. But I'm going to kind of go in chronological order. Get one, sometimes 2 questions per of the movies.
Cool.
But your very first chapter is what you call the Occult Empire. And it sort of is the history of the occult and theater, even going back to Shakespeare's day.
Right.
Would you say that Hollywood, movies, theater in general, is not just about creating crude propaganda, but is also bringing people into sort of an occult ritual and getting them sort of conditioned and maybe, as they say, like opening a portal to their mind? You think that's kind of what the movies do, theater does?
For many, yes. There are many people that would take it that seriously. In fact, there's just a funny interview that popped up it's an old interview from like 10 years ago, but it just popped up recently on YouTube that I saw, and you can look it up. If you look up Nicolas Cage, I know it sounds funny, but look up Nicolas Cage's interview about Ghost Rider and what he calls his neo-shamanic technique of acting. Now, this sounds really funny, and it is funny, but at the same time, there's an element of seriousness to it, because what Nick Cage says is that he views the actor like a shaman, and that the role of the actor is to literally be, in a sense, possessed by the spirit of who he's trying to be. Now, I don't believe that in every case an actor is possessed. I'm not saying that. Acting is not inherently occultic. But there are traditions of acting like the Stanislavski method, where the goal is implicitly to have your persona move into the background and have the alter persona come to the fore. That's the whole. They even have like breathing exercises, very elaborate approaches to how you're supposed to try to do this in the Stanislavski method. And Nick Cage was very open that in his worldview, he sees it as a very shamanic kind of journey, that the actor's trying to be like this voodoo priest guy. And I don't think he's totally making a joke. I think he's being serious. And I wish that I had seen that interview years ago, because I would have put that in my book, because it's exactly what my first chapter is about. Yeah. So what I would say is that for some of the actors who do have esoteric worldviews or occultic worldviews, they would see it that way. But I'm not saying that every Hollywood movie is that, or that every director and producer and actor views it that way. They don't. But there are pretty clear examples of directors, producers, actors who explicitly speak this way in many cases. You've got somebody like Darren Aronofsky. I mean, he very consciously uses Kabbalistic imagery in his movies. You've got Kubrick obviously using esoteric themes in his movies. David Lynch is pretty open about the influence of Tibetan Buddhist type themes in his films. So for certain directors, I would say yes.
That transition perfectly into chapter 2, which is your analysis of Eyes Wide Shut.
And by the way, if you're not familiar, there's the famous book by Crowleyan occultist Kenneth Anger, Hollywood Babylon, and my first chapter was kind of piggybacking off of that. I mean, it's not at all the same as Kenneth Anger's book. His book is like a scandal book of scandalous 20s and 30s actors. But it is kind of piggybacking off that idea of Hollywood Babylon.
Right. In Eyes Wide Shut, on page 27, kind of what we were just talking about, you do say that it functions as an initiation mirroring the desire of the individual to pass judgment on the taboos contained in the film while simultaneously attending its showing. One is, in a sense, participating in the ritual, even if from afar, through the magic of the screen.
Right.
And later on that on page 47, you say, because a lot of this is about, sex rituals of the elite and so on and so forth. So obviously a lot of this analysis deals with the occult factors of sex rituals and so on and so forth.
Right.
But you say that the power structure is not merely focused on wealth and temporal power, but particularly ritualized worldview that seeks to use sex drive as a force for metaphysical power. Power over this drive allows power over the masses. So the idea of, I guess you would say, weaponizing sex as a way to control and manipulate people, that it is sort of heavily represented in this movie, right?
Absolutely. I think, there's no question. Yes.
Because I guess in your analysis, you say it seems like they were setting up Tom Cruise's character the whole time. Like, he kept running into people. These weren't accidents. They were setting him up the whole time.
Yeah, I would say that even if you don't agree with the sort of ritualistic occult view, my reading of this movie, that's how I read it. I don't think many scholars would, or film critics would, deny the Freudian element of sexual repression and manipulation that's going on. I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying that that's what I think Kubrick has in mind. There's undoubtedly a Freudian side to this movie. But I think there are, that's the kind of normie analysis that most film critics would give the movie. Oh, it's Freudian and it's sexual repression in marriage. And I'm going beyond that, and I'm saying that I think Kubrick has a consistent pattern in his canon of films where he's also critiquing the elite. He's showing the worldview of the elite, that it's very different from you and I. And that's why Bill Harford represents kind of the highest level of the middle class. Like, that's as high as the typical successful middle class guy could get as a, well-paid New York doctor. And then he stumbles into this world that is people infinitely more wealthy than him, who live a completely different way. Their day-to-day is completely different, and their worldview is very different. They have the time, just the leisure time, to be able to spend your days studying esoteric philosophies. I mean, if you're a working class dude, you don't have the time to do that. But he's interacting, then stepping into this world of billionaires and multimillionaires, zillionaires, and they're more interested in these kinds of eccentric things. And we know now, especially even after I wrote, I mean, I knew it well from the time that I wrote this book because I had read about conspiracy for so many years. But even since my book came out in the last 2 years, we've seen large-scale Hollywood sex cults like NXIVM be exposed, full of fabulously wealthy people. A direct confirmation of my analysis of the book, or of the movie.
Yeah. I mean, I think Kubrick had to know something. How deep do you think he was? How well do you think he knew?
Oh, I think he knew everything that was going on. I mean, I think that, for example, Human trafficking is a consistent an abuse. That's a consistent theme in Kubrick films. I think he had seen and been in all these circles. Now, I don't think that Kubrick himself was at the top of the pyramid. I think he realized that, when he had to make deals with the Pentagon, with the Air Force to film certain things, and after 2001, and this is very, very well known. That's not my conspiracy theory. There's very clear proof of this. I think Kubrick saw the way the world really runs, and he wanted to portray that in his films and critique it. But that also doesn't mean necessarily that Kubrick is a totally innocent, revolutionary, anti-system figure.
Right.
I mean, he knew this because he was working for the system.
Right. And again, if there is a very close connection between intelligence, the occult, and Hollywood, he probably rubbed elbows with a lot of these people as well. It's like,
well, yeah, I mean, you see him with the top level NASA guys. NASA is 100% just a kind of a covert front for the Air Force deep state, Pentagon. And so, I mean, I show in my 2001 analysis, you see Kubrick hanging out with what's his name? Not just Arthur C. Clarke, but the German. The guy who was like the head of NASA at his time, I forget his name.
The guy that came over from Paperclip.
He may have been a Paperclip guy. I'm trying to remember.
Werner von Braun? Is that who it was?
No, there's another head of NASA. This is after von Braun. This was in the 60s, 70s, late 60s, early 70s. I can tell you here. Here it is. George Mueller.
Okay.
And that's probably from mid 60s picture there.
I guess that
so what I'm saying is you have Arthur C. Clarke, the famous novelist. You've got the head of NASA and Kubrick all working and consulting together.
Right. Yeah. Well, that transitions right into the next chapter, which is Skip The Shining. Honestly, I watched it. I really didn't get into The Shining. I saw Jay Weiner's stuff about The Shining. I don't know, just not really that interested in The Shining. I'm not gonna lie.
Did you not? You didn't like? Oh man, that's huge. You didn't like my analysis?
Not that I didn't like the analysis, just the movie itself. I just didn't get into it. Is it too dark
or something?
Just didn't catch my attention, to be honest with you.
The audio issues for that first part. I think we got everything corrected. So I'm here again with Jay Dyer. We're gonna pick up where we left off. I believe we were starting to get into your analysis of 2001 Odyssey by Kubrick. And you open with that it's an alchemical philosophical presentation of the supposed evolutionary ascent of man from primal ape into a star child, an initiatory process that purports to unfolding through aeons of brute, meaningless time, culminating in a series of revelations associated with zodiacal alignments that awaken the new stage in the process. So is this the first film that you can recall that has the idea of the apotheosis of man, that man can become his own god through technique?
That's a good question. There could probably be earlier science fiction films that people could think of that reference this, maybe obscure ones or maybe a TV series or something like that. But yeah, I would say that the first big film that makes this idea the central plot, except for maybe Metropolis. I think Metropolis is shooting for that with transhumanism, with the robot, the Whore of Babylon robot that's created, and that was back in the 20s, but it's not explicitly transhumanism and apotheosis of man. So yeah, probably I would say probably is as far as I could think.
Especially blockbuster wise, because I don't think Metropolis was that big of a blockbuster. I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, it's kind of before the stage of blockbusters. It was back in the 20s, so yeah.
Right.
You're right.
And then, obviously, how important and deep is the theory of evolution in this movie? Because I think on page, it was 81, you say that it helps solidify the mythology as an orthodox and dogmatic given. So this movie, obviously, evolution is a central theme to this work.
Exactly, right. Yeah, I think that it's overlooked. One of the things I tried to highlight in the book was that we overlooked the fact that even our scientific so-called worldview is oftentimes informed more so by Hollywood and the arts than reading science journals or going to college and taking classes with Mr. Wizard or Bill Nye. We get our worldview from movies, typically, from these kinds of stories, at least in the modern world, most people do. They've replaced the mythologies of old, and that's what myths are, narratives to explain man's place in the universe, the origin of the universe, where we're going. And I see Darwinism as pretty much the preeminent myth of modernity.
Right.
It undergirds everything from scientism to the idea of transhumanism itself. I mean, that's what this movie is about, is the idea. And I have a different take on it. And by the way, I don't think every movie is an initiatory rite or ritual. I only think actually a few are. I think Eyes Wide Shut is intended to be that you're going along that journey with Bill Harford. And I think 2001 is one of those,
right,
where you're being shown the mythology of the elite. I think the elite view it this way, that there's these never-ending cycles of history. You can see this idea in the Vedas with Kali Yuga and these long periods of time where there's a downturn in civilizations and then a rise of civilizations. And I think that's what we have here with 2001 is a similar presentation of all of those cosmological, occult, scientific, transhumanist elements kind of merging into the Darwinian mythos par excellence.
And you call it like an alchemical process. Most of your viewers pretty aware what alchemy is, but could you give just a quick, brief definition of what alchemy is?
Yeah, before the rise of modern science or chemistry, before it became its own separate, strict scientific discipline, it was seen in a more religious, broad scope, interconnected type of view. So the alchemists of old were interested in trying to transmute matter into different forms, doing basically, again, what would be the chemistry experiments of their day. What we know of as alchemy tends to come from Greece, ancient Greece, were some of the first alchemists. There's a good book on this, Anatomizing Divinity. My friend of mine, James Kelly, the first chapter in that book deals with the actual history of alchemy from Greece. But through the Middle Ages, what it becomes is almost like a type of philosophy or worldview where they are seeking the great work, which is to transmute matter into a higher stage or a higher form. And then that becomes an allegory for every individual as well to transform his own thinking process and ultimately his own life into the divine or into the philosopher's stone or whatever. So it functions on multiple levels. There have been alchemists who literally wanted to try to turn, something into gold.
Yeah, like lead to gold, right?
I'm not saying that they have achieved that per se, but then there have also been people who read this in a more allegorical way. If you read, I did a bunch of, when I was in grad school, I did a bunch of essays on the Elizabethan playwrights, John Donne, Ben Jonson, poets and so forth, and they were dominated by this idea of alchemy. They put alchemy into all of their poetry, into their plays. Shakespeare does, Edmund Spenser, Fairy Queen. So it's been typically also given this religio-spiritual notion of man and society and the world evolving into this final stage, this convergent stage, or this godhood type of stage, basically.
Yeah, I think like if you were to do a Wikipedia search, it would say, it was when they tried to turn base lead into gold.
Right.
And that would be sort of what you call the exoteric explanation, where the esoteric is, like you say, bringing man into the next stage of evolution.
Exactly.
Which is, I guess, like you say, the major theme of this movie is taking man to his next stage of evolution. It's interesting in terms of when you talk about how these movies help give us our worldview. They sort of fill in the blanks that we don't get from education and our family and so on and so forth. And I do find it interesting because even, Marx, when he talked about Darwin's, claim of survival of the fittest and evolution, even Marx said that was sort of his worldview imprinted, survival of the fittest, of the capitalist system that was going on in his day, competition and so on and so forth. So I do find it interesting that, your worldview will determine how you interpret the data before you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's the root of what we call presuppositionalism, is understanding that our belief systems don't really operate like we're just neutral observers who come to the table with a neutral approach to facts, and then the facts inform us. It's much more complicated than that, and even modern science has shown this with experiments that there's actually a symbiotic relationship between what we bring to the table and read into the facts, and then what the facts read into us, you could say, what we record from the facts. So there's always kind of this constant dialogue between subject and object going on. And what that shows us is that the Enlightenment ideas of kind of just the neutral observer recording the data is really way oversimplified and not how humans actually interpret the world.
Right. I'm going to ask you about the monolith in this movie. You say that the monolith is consciously Luciferian. With that sort of... that would seem to fit into the theory of the connection between, alchemy, like kind of the occult and sciences together, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The reason I say it's Luciferian is that I typically understand that in terms of ways different groups, certain maybe high-level occultists, high-level Freemasons, they'll look back, say, at Christianity, and they'll reinterpret the message of Christianity into a kind of quasi-Gnostic message where Jesus or Lucifer are kind of these liberator figures who are there to teach man an inner secret teaching gnosis rather than the Ten Commandments or the Beatitudes or something like this. And so what really Christianity functions as is a secret key to searching out the secrets of immortality through technology.
Right. So
they read it in kind of that way. And then the whole Bible gets reinterpreted in that way. And we can see people who took that view, like Jack Parsons, the famous student of Crowley, who was doing all those JPL rocket experiments and thought he was he believed he could connect, science and his occult philosophy into a means by which man could transmute and transcend the here and the now. So you could say there's a absolutely consciously Luciferian notion to this film, and that's why I included that part in there. I'm not saying that Kubrick was necessarily following Crowley. No. I'm just saying that the same ideological strain is present there.
And now 2001 is based on Arthur C. Clarke's work, correct? If I read that right. Yeah. So, Arthur C. Clarke, I think I read earlier in a different, either you did an interview or something, Arthur C. Clarke used to be, like, rub elbows with all of the leaders of tech and those giants, right? Am I thinking of the right author? Like, that's how he was so
Clarke actually was in the circles of people who ran with Crowley, and he was in the circles of, like we talked about in the previous questions, with the high-level people at NASA and the deep state. So, yes, he was in those circles. He was more of a TV... he was kind of like the Bill Nye or the
right.
Neil deGrasse Tyson of his day, where he kind of had a scientific view, but he also... wanted to be involved in I think he was a TV presenter, and he also did fiction. Okay. So that was what he was up to, and that's another example where we see the intersection between the arts, Hollywood, science fiction writers, and the deep state.
Right.
And the occult.
Maybe I'm mixing up my writers here. The guy who wrote Minority Report, that's not Arthur C. Clarke, right? That's what's that guy's name? I'm getting ahead of myself. Oh well. Let's moving on to the next chapter. This is my favorite chapter. Chapter 5. We talk about H.G. Wells.
By the way, did you want to talk about the monolith? I see the monolith as kind of a representation of the unknown, and ultimately a kind of satanic type of presence. And that comes from it's kind of the idea that maybe the technology that we have is alien, that it's beyond what we understand, and that maybe even AI itself is kind of this alien technology. Not necessarily talking about extra biological ET type of alien, but higher spiritual entities. And I think that's kind of the purpose of the sequence of Bowman leaving this universe, is that he's getting past the realms of the gods of this universe, namely the planets, Venus, Mars, Jupiter. That would, in the occultic view, those would be the rulers of our small, prison universe. And so Bowman is transcending those spatial limitations of, the 6 ways that you can move in space, right? Up, down, left, right, back, forward.
Yeah.
And so that's what Bowman is trying to do, is transcend that. And so ultimately it kind of becomes almost a kind of a matrix type of thing, where he steps outside of the matrix. Right.
And Crowley, I think it was called Book of Law, he said was basically automatic written by another entity. Yeah. What did he call it? Like an interdimensional being and so on and so forth.
Yes, correct.
So perhaps this is where all this high-tech
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Is,
Jack Parsons, people like that, they thought that when they were doing their rituals and when they were doing the drugs, they were tapping into and talking to entities that were essentially the gods.
Right. Very interesting, very deep. So yeah, that chapter of your book is very fantastic for those who want to really get deeper into that.
Thank you.
Get the book. Chapter 5, my favorite, talk about H.G. Wells, science fiction propaganda. I have many conversations with some of my science-leaning friends, and it always devolves into some serious arguments. So this is some of my favorite work you did. You say that... I'm sorry, let me get to the right page here. You say that the... I'm sorry. Let me get to the right spot. Yeah, science fiction, modern science, which you call scientism, and religion. You say that all 3 are crucial cultural drivers that disseminate a prepackaged worldview to its consumers. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that prepackaged worldview is?
Sure. It's just the idea of listen to the experts. The experts tell you what you're supposed to believe. They tell you how to live your life. They tell you on a weekly basis now, what right and wrong is, what words you can and can't say. They tell you your origins, your meaning, which is essentially that you're not anything. You are a bunch of goo that has just kind of happenstance tumbled through the universe. The consciousness is kind of an illusion. Free will isn't really a real thing. There's no God. Man is God. The scientific elite priest class will tell you all of these things. That's essentially the world that we live in, and it's going to be ruled over by a corporate technocracy. So that's pretty much everything that I talk about in all my globalism book talks, which I've done, I think, 28 of these now, where I cover the top globalists like H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, et cetera. They're all unified in those points and saying that's what's going to happen. And therefore, they say that because of that, given all that, then it's absolutely certain that man will evolve into a world government. So that's what the whole kit and caboodle is about.
Right. And you'll see this theme in almost every single one of their works. There's things that you cannot question, like you say, Darwinism, scientism.
Darwin, world government, all that stuff is you can't. You can be a globalist and believe a lot of different things, but you can't have They have kind of like their own 10 Commandments, their own creedal confession, you could say. Yeah. But you can't question those.
Never can. And I find this when I read "Changing Images of Man" by SRI. They actually talked about how there was going to be a crisis of the, deterministic, materialistic worldview. They started to realize people were questioning this, and we can't answer all these questions. So the whole book is about, well, what do we give the people? Because we all unconsciously religiously believe in something, whether it's a god or whether it's Darwin, evolution, whatever. We all believe in something. Like you say, we all have a worldview. And this whole book is trying to figure out, well, what are we going to give the people, so to speak? And I find it interesting, towards the end of the book, they say, Freemasonic ideas and Gnosticism, it kind of works, so we're just going to kind of morph into that. It's pretty interesting. And I think you said before that the claims of Darwinism, its overall idea, its metaphysic, is Gnostic in general, right?
It is. I mean, the origins of Darwinian theory are actually from the Masonic Lodge, the Huxleys, the Darwins, the Galtons, their families that really promulgated this theory. They weren't inventing it. They were getting it from ancient Greek philosophy, ancient Egyptian philosophy, and ancient Vedic philosophy. And that's one thing that Freemasonry does, is it does study a lot of comparative religion to try to figure out the commonalities, in my view, ultimately to try to manipulate and control society. That's the whole purpose of why they do what they do. They're not the only group. I don't think they run everything in the world, but they're definitely a group that has been used to try to foist these ideas on the world. So one of the key things that they do is give people from a kind of scientific Mount Olympus what the dogmas of accepted science are. And the Royal Society for a long time has promoted across the world that materialistic, Darwinistic flux worldview. Not just that's the thing, is evolution is not just a theory about biological origins. It's actually a metaphysic about all of reality. It encompasses everything. And it was always intended to do that because it was an intentional replacement of the theological religious tradition of the West and of traditional man in as a whole. So that is really what I was trying to encapsulate in this chapter. And I was trying to show that it's not just H.G. Wells and his science fiction. It's also all these movies that are based on, I mean, science fiction is huge. It pretty much dominates, the blockbusters nowadays. Yeah. And so that's, again, what gives us our worldview and gives us our mythologies. Even if we think we're being scientific, we're not realizing that a lot of the time we're actually not, because science is the scientific method. The scientific method is a tool for understanding the natural world, for developing engineering, technology, etc. It's impossible through the scientific method to gain a grand narrative mythology. But that's precisely what Freemasonry does. And what you're talking about there with that they realized that Darwinism and materialism would not be enough is that, yes, they knew that there would need to be some kind of religious structure that they could create and that they could use. And this actually goes back to Auguste Comte, the father of sociology, who himself was a kind of illuminist. Comte said that we'll just have to create some kind of new global civic religion. So when you look at entities like the Esalen Institute, that was given a lot of money, deeply connected to the deep state itself, that was there to foster the New Age. And so the New Age movement and all of its different forms, and going back to Blavatsky and Alice Bailey and Annie Besant and those United Nations characters, they are there to give the world the new civic religion that would go along with the new Darwinian cosmology. Yeah.
I had like 3 questions. You just answered all 3 of them. Essentially, yeah, it's a replacement theology. They demythologized your origins and gave you a new mythology and a new dogma.
But which was supposed to be scientific, and now they're reintroducing the mystical and the mysterious.
Right, exactly. And again, that was covered in Changing Images of Man. They said they were going to do that. I think that's what we're seeing culminating now. And like you say, science fiction movies is the driver. It's the reinforcement of these ideas.
And that's why I think a lot of you have to also look at the counterculture, the 60s counterculture, LSD, Tim Leary, all of that. We know that was all CIA stuff. I've documented that in a lot of books. In book 2, I talk quite a bit about Laurel Canyon and the counterculture, Dave McGowan, LSD. So the drug revolution and the sex revolution weren't just social engineering techniques. They're part of this changing the image of man, because as you know from that text, the changing image of man isn't just changing man's mind about the world, it's changing man's image of himself and who he is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they did come.
And it's a lot easier to reintroduce the mystical when you've got the prevalence of extreme drug use. I'm not trying to be a Puritan here. I'm not saying that all drug use is necessarily wrong, but I'm saying that the specific promotion of the hallucinogenic revolution in the 60s, and then now the promotion of the mass big pharma, that's what it's really about.
Yeah, they actually have a bunch in there about combining science with the research into telepathy and all those things, and they were saying science, we can't leave these things out. And I think Harmon and all those guys were high off their butts too.
Probably.
When they were writing this book, because they all talked about basically doing ayahuasca and all the hallucinogens and such like that. So great chapter. Seriously, it's my favorite chapter of the whole book. I love it.
Thank you. I had to kind of do. I mean, it's a subtle critique of Darwinian philosophy. I don't approach Darwinism from the vantage point of a scientist, because my training isn't in hard science. My training is in analytical philosophy, logic, those arenas. So that's the approach that I take to criticizing Darwinism, is as a philosophical worldview. And the medium through which I do it is not just boring philosophy articles, but through the lens of film. Right.
And for anybody who wants to read more about that outside of Jay Dyer's book, you should go get Wolfgang Smith.
Cosmos and Transcendence is great.
It's a great book. And then even Yaki does a real good job of taking down Marx, Darwin, and Freud on a metaphysical level as well. Not the science part, the explanation of what science is telling you. Because people, like you said, they have this notion that science is unbiased, that it just tells you brute facts. That's not what happens.
It's not possible to have a brute fact, because this is an important point. I don't want to take over the interview with this philosophy stuff, but it's important to understand that the reason that there's no brute factuality is really obvious if you think about it. And this is kind of what philosophy does, is get us to question our assumptions and no longer believe things that are ridiculous. And one of those things is the idea that, like, if you come to interpret an earthworm, you see the earthworm, you're studying the earthworm, you're going to see what's going on with the earthworm. It's impossible to approach that without thinking about and knowing about all your previous experiences with earthworms and with science and with studying the species and with what you learned when you were a kid about where animals and bugs come from, what you learned in high school, what the movies told you about nature, the documentaries that you saw on History Channel or Discovery Channel or whatever. All of those things inform, even if you're not conscious of it, they inform your perspective of any single event. When you go into the lab to study the earthworm, it's impossible to not bring all of that baggage, you could say. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just how it is. That's the reality of this world. So this ridiculous idea that when a scientist puts on a lab coat, when he steps through the doors of the lab, like he suddenly takes on this magical position where he has no more bias, he has no more cognitive dissonance, he has no more he nobly only wants to seek the truth, and he's not just concerned with getting grant money, right? I mean, that is absurd.
Yeah, definitely. And even that, people say that there's no agenda behind certain sciences, and like I said, I'm reading Lily Kay's book, and the entire Caltech biology department and molecular biology got its start in funding and base and Rockefeller and Carnegie's. They drove the whole thing. Every one of their trustees was on the board of Caltech and so on and so forth. And they all called it the Agenda of Man Project. So yeah, there's no non-biases there. But yeah, so let's move on. We're going to get into AI next, chapter 8. The only question I really have about this, and this is something I struggle with, because we know you could read articles every day about AI. They're getting closer, they're getting closer, they're getting closer, and they keep creating these Autobots, and they kind of talk back to you, but there's still so much program that needs to go in, but they want to create AI in the worst way. So in the movie, essentially, what's his name? David, right? Yeah, David.
David, yeah.
Yeah. So in the end, he's buried in his watery grave, and he comes out to lead this new, like you say, race, and all the humans are gone.
Yeah.
So, why create AI? Why create robots just to replace us? Like, who the hell would want to do that?
Well, people that have the anti-human view. I mean, if you go down the route of the naturalistic, atheistic, materialist, hardcore Darwinian perspective, typically what comes along with that is also its close cousin, the idea that mankind is a plague on the earth. Mankind is a cancer on Mother Gaia. That's the whole heart of the green agenda. And so what needs to happen there, as we know from like the Georgia Guidestones, the idea is to cull the population down to its top percentile, supposedly, right? Oh, we only need the 500 million of the most elite people. That way the future will be more and more and more elite people. But actually that's not really what this ideology is about. We know that's kind of a fraud, because all the people that promulgated this worldview arbitrarily decided that they're the elite just because they are some inbred family in Britain. I mean, that's crazy. So it presupposes that they have the correct standards by which to judge the elite, which is what? IQ? I mean, are we going to kill everybody under 200 IQ? I mean, it's completely arbitrary. It's completely bizarre, and it suffers the same mistake of all utopian ideologies. So this is another version of utopian ideology, which is that if I can rationally calculate something, then everything ought to, in the human world, operate this way. And if it doesn't operate this way according to perfect rational calculation, right, like communists and Soviets would think, then we have to destroy everybody that doesn't perfectly follow the rational calculations. But the human realm is not quantified perfectly. It's not just a bunch of rational calculations. That's one level of reality, but it's not the only level of reality. So when you try to do what's called reductionism and smush everything into just cause and effect, just algorithms, you get this idea that, well, we can just create a new being and then merge with that being, download our consciousness into that being, and that's how we'll live forever.
Right.
But that's only true, that's only possible if the presuppositions of materialism and Darwinism and so forth are all correct. And if they're not correct, it won't work.
Right. I mean, I've always seen the chase for AI was to assist us with merging with machine, like you say, to give us that immortality, and the computing intelligence necessary to make that actually happen, I think, is where AI comes into play. Like, I think it's necessary. I think that's why they're chasing it so hard.
Mm-hmm.
But that was that was the only one I had in there. If you had some more ideas in there, I don't want to give away your book. That's why I'm only asking certain questions.
Well, AI is interesting because it has, it was originally a Kubrick script, and then Spielberg took over and added the alien robots at the end. I mean, some people miss this, that the AI, that the robot, that the aliens at the end are actually advanced robots. Mm-hmm. So the idea is kind of that David is the Adam, if you will, or the creator of that new race of beings that comes along.
Right.
So I just see it as completely anti-human. I mean, the character, the human character is crippled and he's a jerk, and David and all the robots are, of course, humanized and made into saintly figures, and that's really common now in most TV shows, video games like AMC's Humans, or the famous video game Detroit. You have this same idea where all the humans are evil and the bots are kind of saintly. So there's a humanizing and a dehumanizing going on at once, and it's all just part of the same agenda. Right.
That's sort of what you'll notice. That's the big theme is we have all this sympathy for the robots in every one of these movies. Like Terminator 2 did that. I remember watching that and actually getting kind of choked up. He's giving a thumbs up going down, and it's like you actually kind of feel like, oh man, you see the kid crying over the robot. It's pretty interesting that they're kind of pushing that. It's like you say, that pre-packaged worldview they're getting to you. But going into chapter 9, Minority Report, very awesome movie, great analysis. There's a few things that you pointed out that I was never caught myself. But also, I found
Like
an
what?
article on...
Like what?
Was that?
Like what?
Yeah, maybe digging in my notes here. Some of the things I didn't realize was the... Okay, now I gotta find my highlights. Oh, you put me on the spot. You suck. You know what? We'll get to that.
Well, you can delete that if you want.
No, man, it's going up just like this. People are gonna have to deal with it. You know what? It's probably in my notes. We'll get to that. But
Okay.
yeah. So when we talk about Minority Report, there was an article on Medium about how when they did Minority Report, that the writers and the producers actually got with what they say icons like virtual reality pioneer Jaron Lanier and Whole Earth Catalog creator Stuart Brand, and they joined folks from DARPA and the Washington Post and spent days dissecting cultural trends, technological trajectories, so on and so forth. So again, your thesis that the interconnectedness of Hollywood big blockbuster sci-fi films with the people that are creating the tech like DARPA and the people that are trying to create the cultural trends that because the question is usually asked, does life imitate art or does art imitate life? I think that's the answer there, because these aren't people.
Yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, exactly. So again, another piece of you always put these things out, and later on you'll see some innocuous article from Medium or somebody else, and it completely say everything that you said. So again,
yeah, exactly.
Congratulate you for constantly putting this stuff out before anybody else does.
Well, there was also, I'm always learning these new facts. Like when I did Annie Jacobson's big book on the history of DARPA, she ends the book by talking about going to the Pentagon and meeting with people at DARPA and Chris Carter from X-Files and one of the either James Cameron or one of the producers of Terminator. So, and she was making the point that there's always been this relationship, even back to Terminator, where there was discussions with DARPA and the Pentagon. Pentagon would talk to the Hollywood people. Hollywood would talk to the Pentagon people. And so it's always been that way. And that's what I tried to highlight. And what was so surprising to me was because as a kid growing up loving watching movies, you just don't think about it as such an incestuous relationship that they're that concerned with, even to the point of how to craft the toys, not just to sell toys related to the movies, but also to engineer and form the minds of children through the toys. I mean, that's part of what G.I. Joe is for, is to train you to be a military recruit.
Right. And the things that are in this movie, like targeted advertising, retinal scans.
Yeah.
What else did they put in there? The
whole plot, the predictive algorithm of predicting where crimes are coming is real.
Yeah, which it's funny that Obama even talked about having a pre-crime unit, and essentially, like you say, they don't use psychics in a vat of goo. They just use DARPA's
tracking everybody's social media and their GPS and all that stuff.
Yeah, digitizing of all records.
Correct.
Under information awareness, which is, like, as you point out, that's DARPA's plan for the internet all along.
Correct.
Jacques Attali wrote about this. You covered his book, A Brief History of the Future, where basically he says everything that's given to you for comfort will be used to spy on you. Even Foreign Policy magazine, they had an article basically saying the exact same thing, where they talked about Fitbits, iWatches, you name the technology, and it's given to you to record everything about you so they can predict your behaviors.
Right. Yeah, there was an article I found a long time ago about the Schwitzgebel machine, and I talk about that quite a bit because Dr. Schwitzgebel developed this tracker for prison inmates, and it would record your heart rate, record your location, record basically health data about you. Back in the 70s is when he came up with this. The idea was that if you just lock this on the leg of the prisoners, you won't have to worry so much about guards watching the prisoners, because if they're running away, you'll know from the beeps of the raised heart rate and the location of where they're going. So that's essentially what would morph into the digital tracker that we all wear with Apple Watch, iPhone, whatever. So actually, yes, and quite literally, the ideas for a lot of these products and gadgets, they don't come from the free market of people just coming up with the best product. The free market is there as at one level to kind of pick out and choose out the ideas that seem to work the best. But if you look at something like planned obsolescence, that actually shows you that we don't live in a free market. We live in a very, very controlled market, because a lot of products are raised to a level and given status that others it's impossible to get. So, for example, Apple has always worked with DARPA from the beginning. Almost all the big tech companies were started with seed money from In-Q-Tel, CIA, et cetera.
Right.
So they're not, the best, smartest guys working the hardest in their garage. That's just simply not true.
Right. Yeah, things like Facebook don't come out of some dude's garage. Things like Amazon, they don't come out of some dude's garage.
Right.
There's, again, like I said, the book, the molecular biology just doesn't come about by itself. There's millions and millions of dollars that goes into those things.
Yeah, it's a lot of R&D, and that's why one thing about all the censorship is people are saying, well, they're private companies. They're not private companies. Every one of these big tech companies is, as far as I know, they still get government money.
Yeah, definitely. And then this idea that you can predict man's behavior just by knowing more things about him, that kind of goes hand in hand with like material determinism, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, on one level, there's an extreme view that you could have a total predictive accuracy of somebody on the basis of their previous habits and their psychological profile and all that. But again, they'll never be able to achieve omniscience. So I think that the idea is just to have the highest level of accuracy possible, which if you dumb people down and make them more and more a slave to their passions, a slave to their phone, a slave to their whatever enslaves them, then they're much more predictable. You know what they're going to do. So I don't think that. Now, some of them have, a religious conception of this where they actually think that they might achieve omniscience, but whether they do or they don't, they're more concerned, I think, with just coming up with the predictive accuracy. And one of the things that amazing about science fiction is that that's kind of something that Asimov predicted a long time ago. He put that in the Foundation series, that there would be mass algorithms that could track mass movements and try to forecast where the trends are going.
Right. And you made a point on page 184 about DARPA, Google, Apple, Microsoft, that they are all sons of the military-industrial complex.
Absolutely.
And you say even though they look like they compete, they all have the same goal. In my very first podcast was talking about Virginia Hine and Luther Gerlach. They created what they call a SPIN. It's a segmented polycephalous network, where they basically
Annie Jacobson talks about this in her DARPA book.
Oh, really? Yeah. Even though they're all individual, their own hierarchical structures, they still have a horizontal connection. And she says they're all linked on ideology. They might not agree on how to do everything. They might not agree on procedures and such, but they all have the same end goal.
Exactly. That's what we've seen. If people doubt this, what is Bilderberg? Bilderberg is the same idea. Different companies, all the tech elite, all the big corporate elite, they get together every year and they discuss global policy.
Right.
It's not hard to figure out.
Exactly. And then, is there anything else you wanted to bring up about Minority Report?
Not off the top of my head, no.
All right, yeah. If I don't ask you a question and you really wanted to talk, because I don't want to give away your book either. I want people to read this. So if there's something you want to make a point on, jump right in and make that point.
Well, there's a lot here. So, there's 363 pages, 404 footnotes. So would you say it's meaty information?
Very, very. The amount of how many citations that you have, like so many supporting evidence that you have, that you're just not making crap up off the top of your head. You literally have cited information from legitimate sources to make your points. And that's something that people should know. This isn't just some like conspiracy book. This isn't some, Hollywood scandal book. I mean, this is really tying in real world stuff that they actually reveal sort of in the movies. Which, getting into the next one, chapter 10, Logan's Run. Didn't even hear about Logan's Run until not too long ago. You talked about it. I watched the movie. 1976, super corny, but still was a pretty decent movie. But one of the things you point out is how this is a smart city, essentially. Yeah. You talk about, I think, what was the lady's name from IBM? She actually had to talk about how they're going to build.
Jenny Romedy.
Was that?
Jenny Romedy.
Yes.
CEO of IBM.
Yeah, you talk about how essentially you're going to have an entire smart city that's basically ran by an AI bot, which is sort of the theme of this movie. And again, it's 76, and they're talking about doing these things now. So, how far ahead of their time were they doing this? So, the writers and creators of this, did they have any connections to the
I can't remember the guy who. It's a novel. It's a sci-fi novel, dystopia novel. I don't remember the author's name, but it was not super famous, but medium famous sci-fi novel. Kind of had all the same themes that all the sci-fi dystopian movies have. But I think what stood out to me in this one was the AI smart city, as you pointed out, and then also the idea of the allegory of the cave. Because spoiler alert, there's this. It's a kind of an allegory of the cave, Plato, Socrates type of story.
Right.
And on that, there's also the notion of controlled population, controlled, that basically a radical form of euthanasia where everybody dies at age 30. And what they've done is they've concocted a religion that has fooled the masses in the smart city into believing this, that it's actually part of your religious duty to float up into this big microwave and burn up when you're 30. And they had this really weird death cult that surrounds this red lotus, which I just thought all that was really fascinating in a sci-fi movie. And as we know, that the character essentially escapes the city and realizes that most of the worldview that he was given was a lie.
Right.
And that there's a whole world out there. And that was very common, for whatever reason, in a lot of 70s sci-fi stories, that they tended to have a pro-human, pro-population, anti-depopulation narrative.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of these in the 70s. So I just thought that was worth including. So what I had to do in my book was I had many, many more essays on film than went into this book. So I had to kind of choose them by directors and themes. Mainly directors in this one. And in the second book, I chose them on the basis of themes strictly. But I just thought it was because there was so much in this section of part one about sci-fi that we needed to see the insights in these 70s dystopias like this and Zardoz.
And, it's funny because you actually talk about how it says fiction once again presages reality here with the recent proposals to allow IBM's Watson supercomputer to manage healthcare for U.S. citizens as the Affordable Care Act begins. Do you think that was the purpose of Obamacare? Was to get everybody on this AI system?
I think they were testing that out. I don't know that they really thought it would fly yet, but a lot of times what they'll do is test runs on this kind of stuff to see how well it went over. And even if it doesn't, then what they'll do is they'll gauge and say, all right, well, it'll probably take us another 15 years to pass that. Probably take us another 30 years to get that working. So there can be test runs, and even if something fails initially, it doesn't mean, oh, we won, haha, we beat them. They're just going to reintroduce it 15 years later under some other form.
Well, and we see the cries for healthcare now, free healthcare, with Bernie and all those people.
Right.
And so, you see people that really scream that, healthcare is a human right and stuff. They really can convince people of just about anything.
Exactly.
Like you said, they can convince women to kill their offspring. I mean, what can't you convince people to do? as a
Yeah,
right.
just like they convince people to, at age 30, you float up into a big microwave and melt.
It's so funny how that, like you say, how it mirrors real life. It's crazy. And then on page 192, the idea of sanctuary, because like you say, Logan and I forgot the female's name, but they think they found the sanctuary, and they just found it was just another trap. Do you see anything today, like any of today's movements, even today's conspiracies or ideas? I mean, do you see that? I think they understand that people are going to reject this system. Some people could be smart enough. Some people just won't accept it whatsoever. So they need to have that catch-all, that trap to get the supposedly dissidents, just like this. So
yeah, I mean, most of the revolutionary movements that have been there in the last few hundred years, most of the revolutionary ideologues, most of the causes, foundations, movements, human rights, they're all those traps.
Right. Right.
Absolutely. I'm not everybody in alternative media, but a large portion of alternative media is a trap. And many of them are just funded by all the same elites. It's just called alternative media.
Right. Right. Yeah. I've always been kind of 50-50 on the Alex Jones thing. Sometimes always felt that, wow, he's got some really good information.
Well, I was thinking more like the openly known ones, like Young Turks. You know, I mean, they get, like Daily Beast, BuzzFeed, those are conceived of as alternative media. They're actually given like millions of dollars from big foundations.
Yeah. Quigley talks about J.P. Morgan basically creating the progressive movement and creating the New Republic. Still goes on today. The founder of The Atlantic used to be the main editor for the New Republic. So, yeah, I mean, we know that the left has been funded.
So even outside the left-right paradigm, though, I'm saying you can have these kind of fake, revolutionary movements that could be perceived of as a sanctuary. We'll find there's a lot of religious movements that are fake sanctuaries where you try to flee the troubles of modernity in this world. And then you find out you're in some stupid cult that's got a bunch of money from, some zillionaire and some foundation. So there are plenty of analogs to the fake sanctuary.
Yeah. Moving along, unless you have something else to add to Logan's. Oh, actually, let me throw this at you real quick. There's a European tech survey that was done earlier this year, and they asked Europeans from all these different countries, a lot of the EU countries, about what they think about their leaders. And they said, it was odd, 25% of Europeans are somewhat or totally in favor of letting AI make important decisions about running of their country. We are so close to Logan's run. It is insane.
Yeah, I mean, they want it to spit out, actuaries and say, oh, well, based on your health analysis, you run the risk of XYZ. If you don't stop doing this, then we'll cut off your insurance, we'll cut off your credits, we'll do this, that. And by the way, we've determined that everybody over age 40 is hurting the planet. So there needs to be peaceful euthanasia. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Death panels.
Yeah.
Bill Gates talks about the death panels.
It's unbelievable how close we are to that. A lot of people don't see that coming, but you do a great job of pointing those things
It's coming.
Out. It's coming. The next movie I'm going to jump forward a couple chapters, unless you wanted to have anything specific about Zardoz, I can't pronounce it, Zardoz, or Labyrinth or anything like that. I didn't really have any questions about any of those. But Legend, Tom Cruise, that was one of my favorite. I was a kid when that came out.
Me too.
One of my favorite movies. And you say, I didn't catch this before, but Tim Curry's character, he's not the devil. He represents darkness. And like you say, this movie is, I guess, kind of like a coming of age sexually of the main female character. And I don't analyze movies the way you do, but I didn't see that overall. So, again, to everybody out there, this is why you read Jay's work, because he's going to point some things out that you're not going to catch.
Well, I didn't catch this until I actually have a version of the movie that has an alternate musical score. So there's different versions of this movie, oddly enough, and one of them has an alternate musical score with a weird song at the end. And I was paying attention. A lot of times when I do my analysis, I'll have the captions on so I can see what the screenplay says, or what the words in the songs might be. And I noticed the words in the song at the end in this alternate version DVD that I have, which it is a Ridley Scott version, but the lyrics were all total Gnosticism, and it was like really in your face in the lyrics of the song at the end of the film. So I was like, you know what, I need to rewatch that and think about it again. And when I rewatched it, looking for kind of the, I guess you could say, sex magic type of innuendos, they're everywhere. It's all obvious. And yeah, you're right. Tim Curry is actually an underling of what you could call the devil, I guess. He's not actually Satan himself, but he attempts to seduce the princess. It's very phallic. He wants to mate with her. And then what happens is that she goes back to Jack, who kind of represents innocence and nature. That's what she was supposed to represent. And so the defiling of the unicorn, absolutely, when I went back and rewatched it, I was like, it was so obviously pregnant with all these sexual images. And another reason I was cued into that was the fact that Labyrinth was the exact same with Sarah and her journey into her unconscious. It's actually happening during puberty. If you watch the film, it's about her becoming an adult. And the same thing is happening here with Lily. This is Lily and Jack's innocence being lost through sex. And so in a way, it's a kind of a Gnostic telling of the fall of Adam and Eve through sexual imagery. That's what I think is going on here.
Right. It's amazing how you can draw in works of Dante and Plato and a lot of these significant writers through time. You can bring in the themes of their works from such a long time ago into these movies. One of my questions is, if people are unfamiliar with Plato or Aristotle or Dante or any of these, people, what is the purpose of putting them into, big blockbuster films?
Well, anybody who studies literature, most people who want to write or go on to write study literature. And when you study literature, you study the classics of literature, and there are classics, not all the time, but most of the time for a reason, because they tell us something about, the human experience. They're insightful into human psychology. They tell us truths beyond the nightly news. So a big part of it is just that everybody who writes studies lit. So you're going to know these. And there's also archetypal stories. There's archetypal patterns in stories. So when you recognize those archetypal patterns and characters, it's kind of unavoidable that when you make a story, you're going to be utilizing some of those same ideas. So you're playing with, it's impossible to be completely original. There's always going to be elements of patterns and archetypes that come from especially the classics. So that's why we're always going back to Dante or Plato or something like that. It's because it's unavoidable. And they also have a lot of truths. I mean, they speak to us on a deep level because they tell us truths on many levels.
Right. If you had anything else, we'll go on to the next one if you want to.
That's fine.
All right. Blade Runner, Chapter 15. Another very significant movie, big blockbuster. Your analysis, very deep, very good. One of the main things, again in this one, sort of like Logan's Run, but way better, is, you see in this movie genetic engineering, you see AI, you see that megacorps are de facto governments. We see false memories implanted, like MK Ultra, full spectrum dominant surveillance. They can surveil everything and anything about you at all times. There's a synthetic overlay. And again, the theme that man can become God. All these themes are represented in this movie. And you do a
Don't forget
fantastic...
sex bots and
sex bots.
nanotech and Roy Batty as a Luciferian character.
Yeah, I mean, literally every almost. And funny, and again, I'm gonna bring somebody else up. You know, Jacques Attali, and I think it was 1991. He wrote a book called Millennial Winners and Losers in the Coming World Order. And he actually says on page 10, he says, Ridley Scott's celluloid fantasy Blade Runner, a Hollywood confection that contains more truth about the coming age than do some of the classics he was talking about.
Wow.
So again, again, you write about how this reveals so much more. And even through all those 70s and 80s, you make a point of all these dystopian movies, they're pieces of the puzzle. They're not always just the full picture, here's what it's going to be. They're little pieces of all the puzzles. But I think most of it is encapsulated in Blade Runner, right?
It would definitely be one of the most all-encompassing. I can't think of a dystopia that would be more insightful off the top of my head. It's certainly one of the most insightful, absolutely. Because like you said, I mean, you could just run a checklist of, you know, how many things it checks off. And by the way, the implanting of memories, reprinting and all that, that's actually part of MK Ultra. So Blade Runner checks off MK Ultra big time too. And AI actually, cyborgs, AI, Android research also comes out of MK Ultra. A lot of people don't know that, but if you read John Marx's book, the last chapter shows that. And he wrote that back in the late 70s. So I would say yes. I would say Blade Runner checks off more of the overall. The only thing I can think of that maybe does it have drugs? The only thing I can't think of it having is the drug stuff. Is anybody on pills or drugged out or mass drugged in Blade Runner? I can't remember anybody doing that, but that's really the only big key part that maybe Blade Runner left out.
Yeah, I can't. I think in part 2.
Oh, but don't forget the sex bots, which are coming.
Sex bots. Yes, yeah, because the two replicants they were sex bots, right? That's what they were built for. Yeah, it's insane. Yeah.
Well, the Daryl Hannah character was a pleasure model.
Okay. You say, for the viewer who has eyes to see, they are seeing the future itself, as well as the worldview of the ruling class. In fact, Blade Runner ranks with Eyes Wide Shut as one of the most explicit revelations of the method of the ruling oligarchs. You say, sometimes I'm at a loss for words with, you know, how accurate, you know, this can be portrayed. And I think you said Philip K. Dick, I think that was the guy I was trying to think of earlier. No, he was the guy who rubbed elbows with the
Silicon Valley
and stuff like that.
Yeah, so he was hanging out with Silicon Valley before it was Silicon Valley back in the 70s. So he also had done a lot of drugs, and he had also imbibed a lot of Gnosticism. So when he writes Ubik, you know, he predicts the internet. When he wrote Minority Report, he wrote Blade Runner, well, he wrote the short stories that would become those things. So, yeah, I mean, I think that he had special insight because of being in those circles. And what he shows us, I think, is that the worldview of the tech elite, I think he's telling us the worldview of the tech elite is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
And it is Gnostic. It does involve a lot of drug use. You know, a lot of those Silicon Valley elites were tripping acid, doing all the same drugs. They even talk about it openly now. Right. They microdose every day or whatever. So yes, that I think shows us the spirit from which they are deriving their milieu, their worldview.
Right. And so, like in movies like this, when they show you technology that's 20 years ahead, 30 years ahead, it's not just some guy's creative and just thinking of something. Like, no, he knows this stuff is generally coming.
No, he knew that's what they were working on. Yeah, and they were working on AI a long time ago.
Yeah.
I can't say how advanced they were a long time ago, but they were projecting, you know, that's what would be the case. Just like Asimov is projecting there will be this kind of internet thing. Yeah. They're all doing the same thing, projecting where it will go on the basis of what they saw at the time and saying, oh, that'll lead to X, Y, Z.
Right. So my next question: why don't we have flying cars yet? This pissed me off. Where's your
Well,
flying
one
cars?
of the things that a lot of people thought was that the coming tech utopia would give you all this ease and freedom. And what we're learning is that it's not the tech utopia, it's the tech dystopia. Mm-hmm. And so why would they want to give you flying cars when they want to restrict travel, commerce, and movement?
Right. So it was a trap. That's what it was. They said, we'll give you flying cars if you let us do all this crazy shit. Basically.
I mean, all of the goodies will be for the top 1%.
Yeah.
So there probably will be flying cars. There already are flying cars, but they're not very practical. But they're what, $1 million? I mean, like who's gonna? That's not for you. Just like the latest medical advances aren't for the masses. They're for the billionaire class.
Right. And speaking of that, like there was, again, you see all these tech articles all the time where they talk about we're so close to AI, we're about to break through on this technology, we're going to break through on that technology, this is going to allow us to fix all these diseases and this, that, and the other thing. And every time I read one of these articles, and I have certain friends that, post these things on, Facebook. Oh, I can't wait. Like Joe Rogan, this dude cannot wait to merge with machine. But I, always try to make a point that, these things that are coming, they're not meant for us. I don't believe they're meant for us, like you say. I think that the competition is there to drive out the best ideas. But, the way people freak out about inequalities economically, socially, and so on and so forth, even the guy for Facebook, he's like, we're going to create a technology where I can live 200 years, 300 years. He's like, me and my family. He said, me and my kids are going to be able to. And you think about, we already have the tools necessary for these super wealthy to pass down their wealth through these foundations, control their wealth without any taxation and such like that. Now imagine when these guys can take this wealth and keep it for 200 years, and live that long. Imagine Rockefeller living 200 years. It would suck.
Right, that would be the goal, and I'm sure there will be advances in life extension. But again, as you're pointing out, that's not really for the rest of us. And that's kind of what DARPA has sold us for a long time with these like Wounded Warrior Project, and we're going to give the guy who lost his hand in Desert Storm or whatever, Iraq, we're going to give him a bionic hand because he's a special test case or whatever for free. You get $1 million bionic hand for free. And really that kind of stuff is just propaganda. It's just there to promote the idea that tech is going to save you.
Right.
Tech's not going to save you. They're all eugenicists. Bill Joy wrote that famous essay a long time ago about how the future doesn't need us. So they're all post-humanists, which means that they believe that it's time to move past humanity. I don't know. I mean, if any one of them doesn't accept the depopulation agenda, they would not be welcomed into the club. Yeah. So they might still be rich. They might be an outlier. I'm sure that there will be elites and wealthy people who don't go along with the plan, but they won't be the norm.
Right. Yeah, there was an Economist article where they said that genetic engineering will lead to things that Darwin could only have imagined, and it was an article by the Economist.
Keep in mind too that also I am of the view that I'm not saying there aren't fantastical advances, but we're in a situation where there is a lot of BS. And even we know now, after all the lies of the establishment over the last several years, Russiagate, weapons of mass destruction, on and on and on, so many lies, it's not any different in the scientific realm. They will churn out these bogus science advanced stories all the time. And I've seen them for years. And supposedly we can now clone this. Supposedly we can now do X, Y, Z. And then you actually read into it, like when they had the ear on the back of the mouse, they said, "Oh, look, we've cloned an ear and genetically grown an ear in the back of a mouse." When you actually read what they did, that's not what they did. All they did was stick ear cartilage inside the skin of a mouse. They didn't really clone an ear. But what they're calling cloning is that the cartilage continued to grow in the back of the mouth,
right?
The back of the mouse. So they didn't actually grow an ear on the back of a mouse. And so what I'm saying is that there's a lot of even large scale bullshit when it comes to look how advanced we've gotten. And it's for a reason. It's to make people think. And I'm not saying there aren't amazing advances. There are, but I'm saying that it's not, you're well within your epistemic rights to doubt a lot of these out there stories.
Yeah. When I see the whole, genetic engineering and such like that, I also think about Bertrand Russell. He talked about in his, scientific outlook, where he basically said, once we figure this out, we're going to have two species of humans.
Right.
We're gonna have the elite that govern over, and then we're gonna have the dumbed down workers that are just gonna be muscular apes to do all our dirty work for us. And I point that every time someone celebrates this stuff, I'm like, guys, this is not good. It's not good for us. I hope they don't figure it out.
Except that they move past that now, and they don't even care about dumb muscular workers. They actually want either an autistic computer class that just does coding and things like that. And then robots will do everything else.
Yeah. And that's another reason for it. See, that's the thing that scares me too. I don't want to get too off topic, but with the AI thing, like if they can create essentially a class of between robots and autistic coders to manage the robots, and you have a planet of 7 billion people to feed, what's to stop them from saying, like you say, you know what? We've got no more use for labor, and we don't have a use for consumers anymore. We need just enough people to sustain this life. We can genetic alter our kids to where our kids are going to be 180 IQ geniuses, 6'2", 200 pounds. We don't need the masses anymore. Because I feel like now they still need us for labor. They still need a talent pool, because they can't control IQ yet. So they still need enough people to pull the talent pool. So I think once they're done and they lock down the genetic engineering, creating super geniuses, I think we're screwed. I think that's when they're gonna, because we're about to get into the Bond section and Prometheus, but you talk about the breakaway civilization that's constantly shown in a lot of these movies.
Right.
It's not in your book, but the one with Matt Damon, I think is Elysium.
Elysium,
yeah, where they had the breakaway civilization and such like that. It was just like, you're gonna leave the planet. It's like, you guys do whatever you want, either that or depopulation, which, like you said, is one of the 10 commandments of the globalists, is depopulation.
On a mass scale, right?
Yeah, on a mass scale. Yeah, definitely. You want to jump into Bond?
Sure.
Bond, you said you wrote your thesis on Bond, right?
Correct.
Yes. The first one you talk about is Diamonds Are Forever. And you make a statement, and I want you to elaborate if you could, but you say G.I. Joe is the arm of Cobra and Bond is the arm of Spectre. This, as you say, in the Bond movies, they revealed the way things really work. That between the illegal drug trade, between the sex trafficking, between all these things, these are the levers of power. And if you could just kind of explain how Bond is the arm of Spectre and G.I. Joe is the arm of Cobra.
Yeah, because James Bond is the emissary. He's the assassin of the Queen's Imperial Secret Service. So when we know about the history of the British Empire, we know that the British Empire is essentially a global Masonic organization that eventually declined, and then we have the rise of the American Imperium. But the British Imperium gave way to the American Imperium. And essentially, it's just the Anglo-American establishment, as Quigley calls it. So that's what Bond represents, and what Bond is there to do is to project onto all of the opponents of the British imperial system the very things that Secret Service, British intelligence, etc., themselves did.
Right.
So that's the point of that comment. Just like in G.I. Joe, you have G.I. Joe and Cobra, and they're actually the same. They're on the same team. That's kind of the point of what I was saying with G.I. Joe there was that in the real world, James Bond works for Spectre, and it's James Bond who is the busybody of Bilderberg, of Blofeld.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that Spectre is, over the government, controls the government, horizontal equal
Absolutely.
to the government?
Well, in the novel, Spectre emerges out of SMERS. SMERS was Soviet counterintelligence. Mm-hmm. And in the first couple stories, Ian Fleming actually put that into the novels as who James Bond was fighting, right? Because it's the free West versus the evil Soviets in the Cold War dialectic. And so back then, that's when Ian Fleming was writing, when it was the fresh into the Cold War period. And then what he tells us, interestingly, early on, this is one of the reasons that Ian Fleming is so fascinating in terms of predictive programming, is that SMERS quickly becomes Spectre. Just go watch Dr. No and From Russia with Love, because within the first few Bond movies, it moves into becoming not a Soviet thing, but an international terror organization.
Mm-hmm. And you say Bond
so
was
he's telling us that the Cold War will become war on terror.
Yeah. So that you said that's the first movie that sort of brings that out, right? That
we
go from the Cold War to international terrorism.
Right, that I'm aware of, yeah.
Yeah.
There could be some other spy movie I don't know about that does that. I don't know.
I think it's accurate as first one I can think of. And then you say on 257, and this is a big point, is that the world government that presently exists is one of covert, hidden rulership by various oligarchs. Mm-hmm. While a certain level of competition is tolerated, these oligarchical Dr. No's are not the denizens of secret Soviet underground layers, but the Bilderberg attendees and banking magnates. Mm-hmm. Again, my very first podcast was on the spin networks, and she lays this all out as well. I think she wrote it in 77, where basically the major corporations, the families, the banking families, the international banks themselves, IMF, BIS, World Bank, all those, they all work in concert, and Absolutely. That is your world government.
That's Spectre. Yeah, that's the real Spectre. That's the real power in the world. And the irony is that one of the key means that they have cloaked themselves from public purview is by movies like James Bond indoctrinating the public into thinking that the good West is saving you from all these villains, when the people that run the good West are the people you're talking about.
Yeah, spreading liberal democracy.
That's the whole point, right? Yeah. And there's not really liberal democracy.
It's not.
It doesn't exist.
It doesn't. The Moonraker chapter was your one about the breakaway civilization, like we talked about before. It was odd, the scene about the fake moon landing, and you talk about, NASA is a cover essentially for all DARPA and all these things.
Exactly.
Would you say like they're really trying to create like Skynet, like NASA is a cover for essentially Skynet?
Yeah, I have a whole lecture I did 3 years ago in Texas, and then I covered it again last year at AV9. And those lectures are public on YouTube. You can watch those lectures. They actually talk about the declassified Pentagon DARPA documents from the 80s in the Star Wars Defense Initiative, where they wanted to create Skynet. Skynet is based on that.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I don't think that they literally have a conscious AI network, but what they have is moving towards this fully integrated Internet of Things that taps into all of these nodes and networks. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. It's essentially like a giant surveillance thing, more so than it is. And there is AI predictive involved in it, but it's not like Skynet is conscious and he's telling the military what to do. The military, they do have AI that can give you these different actuaries and situations and what to do in this case. But it's not consciously like talking to them and saying, Dr. Rumsfeld, thank you for coming. I have now done my projection. If you've seen the movie Demon Seed, I did a video on Demon Seed. That's how that's actually, I mean, that's a silly sci-fi horror movie, but it has this idea in it where basically the tech corporate elite, Pentagon elite, are consulting this AI thing about how to run everything. And that's partly true, but what happened, of course, in the movie, it becomes ridiculous because it becomes sentient and then it wants to impregnate a woman. Jeez. But it's actually worth watching though, because there are some insightful predictive elements in developments in Demon Seed. But I don't think it's like that. But they do have this sort of advanced pre-crime type stuff that we were talking about with Minority Report.
Definitely. And in the Moonraker chapter, when you say, Drax intends to become a new god whose progeny will all call him the new man, the new creator through technology. Again, the apotheosis of man.
Exactly.
A theme that we consistently seem to see, and even in the Bond movies. Something I didn't catch. Now, granted, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't grow up on Bond. I didn't watch a lot of Bond. So I found your channel and you talked about Bond a lot, and I'm like, I gotta watch this because I don't remember it, any of these things. So it's very, very good.
Well, me too. I mean, I did grow up watching James Bond movies, but my growing up period was Bond in the late 80s and early 90s. So I was watching Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan, and all of those have a lot of predictive programming too. It's just I haven't gotten to all of them. It's I mean, there's 24 or 5 Bond movies, and then there's all the novels. And when I was doing my thesis, I was doing it just on. I had to narrow it down. I had to select a few of the stories and Ian Fleming, because I mean, if you just look up James Bond on Amazon, you'll get countless books. I mean, you could never read them all. But so these essays aren't what I wrote in terms of thesis. These are just other essays that I wrote as I was working through the different Bond films, and I've seen them all many times now, but every time I watch one, I catch new stuff. Like even in these older ones, like with Emilio Largo and Thunderball and things like that, like you start to notice, oh, that's like really similar to Aristotle Onassis, who was a big elite globalist character, and you start to realize these figures kind of do match up to people, because actually Ian Fleming was hanging out with Aristotle Onassis. He actually offered to fund Dr. No to film it. So he was running in the circles of the elite. So that's another reason why when you see a fabulous zillionaire on a giant yacht with a white cat, there really are people like that. It's not a joke. It's real. That was the point of my book in part.
Yeah, what's funny is it's been a while ago that I found that he was British intelligence, that he
was a high-level black ops guy.
Yeah, and his family was very wealthy and very connected, and that he, Roald Dahl and Bill, what's his name? Bill Donovan.
Noel Coward,
yeah, all those guys set up our OSS.
Correct.
Which later became our CIA.
Exactly.
I don't think a lot of people. I actually told someone recently.
Knows that.
Yeah, I told somebody recently about how Ian Fleming, the guy who wrote Bond. Oh yeah, he was a British spy. Really? What? I'm like, yeah, he actually helped us set up our spy unit. What? A lot of people didn't know that. I of course didn't know until a couple years ago when I read your work.
Well, some of the operations that he was involved in with the Allies, the titles of those operations actually later became Bond stories.
Right.
So GoldenEye is an operation that he was doing against fascist in Spain, I think.
So again, his novels that later became movies, there's a lot there. This guy didn't just create stuff out of whole cloth. This is probably a lot, like you said, a lot of real missions, a lot of real people that he wrote into these novels that became movies.
And I want to stress too that I'm not overplaying this. I realize that all of these are goofy and Hollywooded up. But the point of my essays is just to point out that there's a lot more reality in them than you would think.
Right.
I'm not saying that like every single thing in the Bond stories is Ian Fleming actually did all that shit. No,
Right.
It's not like that. Bond is actually a combination of a whole bunch of people. He's a combination of old British spies, Maxwell
John D, right?
Knight,
John D was one of them?
plays into it, and Ian Fleming himself. So he's a combination of people. And by the way, did you know that that he based Blofeld and Le Chiffre on Crowley?
I did not, but I think you covered that in your book, don't you?
Yeah, the two villains. Well, the two well-known villains from Bond. In the more recent Casino Royale, it's Mads Mikkelsen. That's Le Chiffre. His eye drips blood. Yeah. That's based on Crowley, and then the bald Blofeld character is based in part on Crowley.
Interesting. And now, did he personally know Crowley? Did he hang out with Crowley?
No, there's not evidence that we know that he personally met him, but he knew of him, and it was actually him and the people he worked with in his unit, his PSYOPs unit. They were the ones that were actually contacting Crowley and working with Crowley as a part-time MI5 asset.
Yeah, because Crowley was a part-time spy for the British, right?
Yeah, I think it was Maxwell Knight is the guy who was. Knight was actually into the occult, so he was in the circles of those people. And Dennis Wheatley, who is another famous British intelligence guy, he wrote a whole bunch of books, occult books. We in Esoteric Hollywood, we did The Devil Rides Out, which is a Dennis Wheatley story. And he always puts. There's always Christopher Lee playing in some Dennis Wheatley, because there's another movie called To the Devil a Daughter that Dennis Wheatley did the story to, and Christopher Lee is in that. And actually, I dug up the fact that Christopher Lee actually at one time worked in special operations. Now there was some, who Christopher Lee is, right? Or Christopher Lee, right?
I like him.
Yeah, there was some speculation that he was an assassin, but I found a bunch of articles and he disputes that. He says no. He says I was in RAF Special Forces, but I wasn't an assassin. Of course, he's going to say that.
Of course, yeah.
But it is funny that he always plays those occult roles, and he plays Duc de Richelieu in Devil Rides Out, which is he's like kind of this white magician that fights. What is that guy's name? I can't remember the guy's name, but actually, the whole point of this story is that the bad guy in Devil Rides Out is also based on Crowley.
Right. Crowley, that guy's very influential between the Beatles and characters in movies and characters in books.
That's his name. The bad guy in Devil Rides Out is called Mokata, and he runs this sex cult. And he's based on Crowley, because Dennis Wheatley knew. I think he did know Crowley, perhaps.
Right. But now Crowley. So L. Ron Hubbard created Scientology, rolled with him.
Gerald Gardner started Wicca.
Yeah, you have JPL Parsons,
right,
with Crowley. Supposedly, I guess Crowley was influential in creating Beatles music. I think I read that somewhere. Was that in Dave McGowan's book?
Well,
I think I read that.
I don't know. He influenced the Beatles.
Yeah, he influenced them. Yeah.
I don't know. I wouldn't say that he created Beatles music, but
I thought I read somewhere that he actually wrote some of their songs. It's speculation probably, but I
haven't heard that.
That's pretty interesting.
It could be, but I haven't heard that.
But since you brought up Devil Rides Out, again, we were talking about the men that set up the OSS that later became the CIA. These were spies, and then you talk about the convergence of spycraft with the occult. That there is a really big crossover between the occult and the spy world, correct?
Absolutely, sure.
Because I especially when you say Masonic lodges, they're good dens for spies, right?
Sure. Yeah, trafficking and secrets. So there's a natural relationship between those two and between the world of acting.
Right.
Because spies pretend to be what they're not.
Right. Yeah, Argo.
So absolutely,
about that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. There's even plenty of, like you said, plenty of movies that even show us this. Yeah. Argo is a great example. Argo's propaganda, but it does show you that, right?
Right. Twin Peaks. Honestly, never watched one episode of it. I'm interested in doing it just because I've read your analysis on it. And, you said recently, I think one of the creators wrote a book that
Mark Frost,
confirmed every single thing that you wrote about Twin Peaks, that your analysis was 100% spot on.
Correct.
I don't have any reference to ask questions because I've never seen it, other than people always talk about the revelation of the method.
Right.
So how much of Twin Peaks is a revelation of the method?
All of it. It's just as if you enjoyed the esoteric aspect, in the sense of understanding what's going on, and that's what I mean by enjoyed. If you enjoy Kubrick and what you see in Eyes Wide Shut, or the conspiracy aspects of Kubrick, David Lynch is a must, because he's doing the same thing. He's just as important a esoteric filmmaker as Kubrick, easily. So
he
absolutely.
Probably reads a lot of occult stuff, right? To be able to put that into his
He
films.
does. In fact, I just yesterday was sent an interview of all people between him and Russell Brand. Russell Brand just had David Lynch on, and ironically, oddly enough, the whole interview is about the Vedas. So he's talking about Vedic religion, Vedic philosophy, in this 30-minute interview with Russell Brand. I'm not endorsing it all, but I'm just saying it's interesting,
right.
Just in the sense of another kind of confirmation of a lot of the analyses that I've done of Lynch films, is confirmed in this interview where they're discussing esoteric Vedic philosophy.
So anybody out there who
my intuitions were all correct, basically. Yeah. And now Mark Frost is the co-creator, co-writer,
okay, cool.
of Twin Peaks, and it was last year. Yeah, sometime last year that he put out because they were prepping for the return of season 3 of Twin Peaks. So he put out a book called The Secret History of Twin Peaks, which is a fascinating book because it's almost like Dungeons and Dragons level lore for this fictional town that they created. And they have all of this esoteric and Masonic philosophy. And that's why in part 2, I included my analysis of season 3 of Twin Peaks, because and I included this the quote from the book, his book, where it confirms everything that I'd said, that you've got basically behind the American power structure is a kind of an occult power structure.
Right.
And I don't think anybody in 1991, 92 had any conception of that when they were watching Twin Peaks. They didn't understand what they were watching. It was so out there, it's so bizarre, and at the same time it's satire, it's making fun of soap operas. It's neo-noir. It's doing all these things on different levels, and it's also tapping into a very pronounced esoteric philosophy, and you just don't see that very often.
Right.
And it also touches on sex trafficking and that kind of stuff too.
Yeah. I've not seen it. I'm interested in seeing it just strictly because I read your analysis of it. It seems like something I'd very much get into.
Have you seen any David Lynch movies?
None. I might have and not even know, because I don't really get into who's the creator and stuff like that. I'll watch it and then just kind of move on.
Well, I think with David Lynch is that he the movies that he makes. There are predecessors. There are movies that influenced him. Ingmar Bergman and Sunset Boulevard, but David Lynch movies are not like anybody else's movies. They're so weird. You will know once you do watch some, if you choose to, you will know from then on when you're watching a David Lynch movies, because they're Lynchian. So.
Right. Okay. Well, like I said, I'm interested in it.
They're very revelatory.
Very, very, very cool.
Did you get that? So you read the chapter on Twin Peaks. Did you get the impression that it is revelatory?
Yeah. That's why I asked the question. It's because I've read Alice Bailey's Externalization of the Hierarchy, read Changing Images of Man, and I think there's a conscious effort to sort of indoctrinate the world into certain levels of the occult.
Theosophy. Actually.
Theosophy, yeah.
In season 3 of Twin Peaks, there are theosophical elements explicitly. In fact, I just remembered that in one of the footnotes I cite an essay on theosophy in Twin Peaks. So you're on the right path there.
Yeah. And again, when I read, the white papers and such, they understand there's a crisis of, the metaphysics, and I think that they are consciously trying to create, like you said before, a replacement theology or replacement metaphysics, and they want it to be based on Gnostic ideas, Freemasonic ideas.
Right.
And so when they say revelation of the method, as Bailey says, eventually we got to reveal this to the masses. We're going to get to a point where we're almost completed. The next step is we have to show these people and get them to somehow accept it. And I think that's why these things get, like you say, packaged in movies, especially in sci-fi. I think that's why it's packaged in there. It's easy to consume it. It's easy to just accept it as, that's just the way it is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Your conclusion of the book, the marriage between Hollywood, CIA, the occult, mafia, sex trafficking, mind control, the whole thing. Do you think that some of these big-time actresses and actors that do these types of movies, some of them have an idea of what they're doing, but do you think there's like the casting couch to sort of get blackmail on them, to sort of get them to do these things and keep quiet about it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the casting couch has been known forever, but I think all manner, anything that you could think of goes on. Some A-listers work for intelligence agencies. Some of them are high-class prostitutes. Absolutely. Some of them are probably involved in blackmailing other people. Everything. Check all the boxes. Yeah. Absolutely. And there have been plenty of. I'm not just saying that. I mean, there have been plenty of cases that come out where we do see this kind of stuff going on. I mean, again, just think of the NXIVM cult. Even though that wasn't really A-listers. You have high, billionaire families. You've got top political operatives, and you've got this corporate world of this Amway pyramid type scam connected to one of the top TV shows of the 2000s, Smallville. I didn't watch Smallville, so I don't really know when it was on. But she's not an A-lister, but she was a pretty famous TV actress.
Right.
All tied into this cult. And then one of the famous royalty, Catherine Oxenberg, her daughter was in the NXIVM cult. She had to get her out. She's a famous British royal, British noble family. So it touches that all over that top tier sphere of the 1%.
Yeah. That's it for the first book. Do you have anything you want to tell us?
Well, I was just going to say that sometimes I include, it might seem strange, like in that last chapter, I include a little bit of discussion of LA Confidential and Black Dahlia. And a lot of people didn't think Black Dahlia was that good of a movie, but my choices in the films weren't always just on the basis of obviously critical acclaim. Some of the movies were, even at times, I include B movies in my analyses. Part 2 has a couple B movies. You could argue, I guess, that Legend is almost a B movie.
That movie.
I mean, it did have a theatrical release, but it was kind of, wasn't the highest production value and whatnot. But although Tim Curry's Devil was a lot of production value, but
it was such great makeup on that too. His character was
it is, exactly. Yeah. Actually, as I looked, I'm not sure. Maybe I don't really. In part 1, I don't actually think I have any literal B movies. There's a couple in part 2 just to kind of make it a little more lighthearted, but
you want to give us a
but
preview
you
of part
do
2?
you do want to check out Black Dahlia, because Black Dahlia is one of the famous ritual murder cases in Hollywood. And there's a lot of theories on that. Most people think it was George Hodel, but I included the discussion of that in that last chapter just to point out that the beginning chapter was Hollywood Babylon. The closing chapter just reminds you of that there is this deeper, darker side to Hollywood that's not just a cult. It's not just intelligence agencies. It's not just powerful financiers. It's all the above.
Right. Definitely. So do you want to preview part 2? Let us know what part 2 is about.
Yeah, and you don't have a copy of it yet?
Not yet, no.
Okay, that's fine. Because I was going to ask you if you had it with you and wanted to talk about. So what I did in part 2 was I organized it in sections like part 1, but what I did was I went concentric circles from most rational to a little crazy to pretty crazy to crazy crazy. So it gets wilder and wilder as you read through. Everybody so far thinks part 2 is better. They think I did it's better written. It's more entertaining. There's more funny parts. But I start with Hollywood mobs, cults, spies, and the occult. So I talk about The Aviator, Godfather trilogy, Hollywood dialectics, even some comedies come up that you might not expect, like Clue from the 80s.
Love Clue. Another Tim Curry.
Yep. Clue is actually about the Cold War. And I didn't realize that until I went back and after I'd read Quigley and all that stuff, and I went back and watched Clue, it made a lot more sense. There's silly stuff in here like Point Break. And I included Point Break just because it's actually kind of FBI propaganda.
Right.
You don't think about it, but it is. I'm talking about the one with Keanu Reeves and I'm not talking about the shitty remake, right? V for Vendetta, had to put that one in there. That's all about dialectics. The famous British series The Prisoner, that's also one of the most predictive programming heavy series of all time, and it's only 17 episodes, one season, with Patrick McGowan, The Prisoner. Have you seen The Prisoner?
I've not. It's another thing it's on my list, trying to find.
And I'm really proud of my essay on The Prisoner. I think it's a really good essay. Polanski's Ninth Gate, super occultic.
Love that movie.
Esoteric movie. Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, the movie Twin Peaks, and season 3 is a chapter. I go into a lot of depth there. Back to the Future trilogy, Goonies, Ghostbusters, Poltergeist, and Stranger Things, and Time Bandits. So I wanted to hit more of those fun 80s movies that we all grew up with, like I did in the first one. I did Legend and I did Labyrinth, but I wanted to do, and Never Ending Story. But I also wanted to do Goonies, Ghostbusters, Poltergeist, Stranger Things, Time Bandits, because those were big ones. And I had not yet touched any Terry Gilliam movies. Terry Gilliam movies are all about predictive programming and dystopias. Mm-hmm. So I felt like, man, how could I do a whole book and I haven't even touched Terry Gilliam?
No.
So then we moved. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead. I'll let you finish.
Well, if you're not familiar, he did 12 Monkeys, which is one of my favorite movies. It's a great one with Bruce Willis, predictive dystopian movie. Right. He did Brazil. He did Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, Heath Ledger's last movie before he dies, and Heath Ledger is actually ritually murdered in the movie, which is very strange.
That's odd. Yeah.
I just actually rewatched Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus because we're going to do, I'm about to hit 40,000 subscribers, so we're going to do a Terry Gilliam party for 40,000 subs.
Awesome.
So we'll be doing 12 Monkeys, Brazil, and what did I just say? Imaginary.
Yeah.
Stranger Things, I had to include that one in there. It's all about mind control. And even though it's not an 80s movie, it's playing on all those 80s tropes.
Yeah.
Then in section 2, we moved to Hollywood mind control. And my original intention was to touch on all of the Hollywood mind control movies. And then I realized there's no way I could fit them in the book.
Too many.
So I had to make a selection. I did a chapter just on LSD in Hollywood, a chapter on Clockwork Orange, They Live, Lost Boys, American Ultra, The Cell, which is an overlooked movie, with Jennifer Lopez and Vince Vaughn, and Neon Demon. And then in section 3, we do Hollywood weather control and aliens. So I go back to aliens, how aliens are part of psychological warfare, movies that dealt with geoengineering, Avengers, Snowpiercer, Dune, David Lynch's Dune. And then we move to, and Shyamalan's Signs, by the way, which is not about weather control, but it's another alien type movie. And then in section 4, we move to Hollywood transhumanism. So it goes to the craziest. And I talk about NGOs, I talk about transhumanism, I talk about ideologies being weaponized. And the movies I chose were Tron, The Matrix, Running Man, Terminator series, Her, Ex Machina, Westworld, Cherry 2000, which is a great B movie. And I closed the book with Metropolis.
It's a lot of, how many chapters is that total?
It's a little more. This one is actually 36 chapters.
Jeez. That's a lot of movies.
It's still under, it's three, this one's a little longer. It's 393 6 pages.
Okay.
So it's still under 400.
Goonies, one of my favorite movies growing up as a kid. A lot of people go like, how is there anything conspiratorial in Goonies? And you pointed out something. I've heard you talk about this before. Give people a little sneak peek of why Goonies is in this list.
Well, it takes place in Astoria, and this gets into a very famous, rich, wealthy family and the Eastern Seaboard, or that Seaboard elite. Let me see. I'm trying to pull it up, and it gets into Skull and Bones. It gets into the Jolly Roger, the symbolism and meaning of the Skull and Bones, the Jolly Roger. Astoria is named after the Astors, a famous bloodline. They come up in Tragedy and Hope.
Right. Yeah. Section 2, Tragedy and Hope.
Correct.
Astors,
and
400.
And so I don't think that's accidental. I think it's there for a reason. And I also noticed that there's something interesting going on with Goonies in terms of FDR, the role of FDR, and what's called a Rube Goldberg machine. Do you know what a Rube Goldberg? Yeah. I actually kind of think the whole movie is kind of this sequence of events, a chain of events, like a Rube Goldberg machine. And I caught that the last time I watched it, when everybody's familiar with kind of the trap door that they've arranged when who's the fat kid? When he comes to the
Chunk.
When Chunk comes to the house and there's this weird, goofy Rube Goldberg machine to open up the gate, I started realizing that actually the whole movie functions that way.
Yeah.
The booby traps are all that way.
Yeah.
And so, you can debate that. I might be wrong about that, but it caught my attention, and I think that there's something to that.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in Goonies that I think a lot of people overlooked.
I thoroughly enjoyed the movie. I'm gonna have to watch it one more time now. I haven't watched it since I read the or listened to.
Did you grow up watching it?
Oh yeah. It was one of my favorite movies growing up.
Yeah, me too.
The and then They Live. Is that one of your B movies? That wasn't a blockbuster, right?
It wasn't. I guess technically I think it had a theatrical release, and it did. I mean, it did have a low production value, but I guess you could debate whether They Live is a B movie, probably roughly. But yeah, I think, They Live is actually one of the ultimate conspiracy movies. Yes. I felt like it was just absurd not to have an analysis. Actually, when I spoke in Texas a couple of years ago, and I did my talk on Hollywood propaganda, a lot of people in the audience were like, why didn't you do They Live? Where's They Live? Yeah. So I had all these people bitching that I hadn't done They Live. So I finally got around to it, wrote like a, 15, 20 page super analysis of They Live. Came out really good. And I forgot to mention the movies that I did did I mention the occult movies? Yeah, I did. Actually, Lost Boys. Yeah. So Lost Boys is a mind control occult movie too. But yeah, They Live is great. I mean, John Carpenter was very foresightful in that movie.
Yeah, you've done. I think when you did Annie Jacobson's book, you also covered John Carpenter's other stuff, The Escape from
New York.
Yeah, New York.
Yeah, and I also did a live stream on the Thing too, which I think the Thing is worth checking out as well. And yeah, Escape from New York actually has some really interesting predictive, like you said, these kind of DARPA surveillance elements to it that were way ahead of their time.
Definitely. So, jaysanalysis.com, that's where you want to go. Jay has, 1,500 articles?
Oh, I don't know if it's that many. I mean,
that was
probably around 1,100.
Okay.
And then, in the last year, I've gotten heavy on doing videos. So I think now there's like 800 videos now or something like that.
Yeah. So not only do you have 2 books with these, but you also do 15-minute videos talking about the same thing you do in the books. You do some videos on your site, as well as you have just some write-ups as well, things that maybe just didn't get into the book.
Right.
So if
there's actually a whole nother book's worth of essays.
Yeah.
That aren't in a book yet. So if Esoteric Hollywood 2 sells good, there'll be a part 3, because my idea was just to do a trilogy, but that'll just depend on how well part 2 sells.
And so if anybody really enjoys movie analysis and you want to find your favorite movie of all time, I'm pretty sure Jay's done it. You're about to do another TV show. Is that in the works, you said?
Yeah, we have one that's being shopped. So we did what's called a sizzle reel, where you film like a 5-minute version of what the show will be and who's in it, and then they shop that around to the different channels and networks. And so I don't know, it's being shopped. So we've heard that there was some interest, but that kind of stuff usually takes a long time. So
yeah,
it'll probably be months before we know anything for sure.
Well, good luck on that. I hope that goes through.
Thank you.
Also on your site, you cover theology.
And by the way, this show would be different from Hollywood Decoded. I'm very happy with Hollywood Decoded. I think it's a great show. The episodes turned out as good or better than I expected.
Yeah.
But this will be different. This show, I can't say the name of it or anything like that, but it's not just movies. It's actually pop culture. Okay. So there'll be movies, fashion, music, nice. TV show, all of it being discussed.
Nice. Very nice. And for those who are into theology, you have many lectures on theology, Orthodox theology, right?
Yeah.
You cover, my favorite of your section is your globalist series.
Thank you.
I've watched every single one of them. I've bought so many books based on your recommendation list. You have a recommendation list of all the books that you've covered that'll help people.
Well, not all the ones I've read, but
the
globalism book series. But when my site when I had some issues with the site, I had to restore the reading list. I've got most of the reading lists fixed, but all the links are broken, so I have to fix all the links. But you can go and see all the recommended reading for sure.
Right. And then philosophy. You have a lot of articles on philosophy. You have a lot of lectures on philosophy, which I think your strength between your philosophy and your theology together. You have some of the best apologetics I've ever read and I've ever seen or listened to. So those who want to get a better source of apologetics, Jay should be your source. He's one of the best.
Cool, man. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Is there anything else you'd like to promote?
No, just that if you do want to get copies of either part 1 or part 2, you can get them at my website, because if you get them from Amazon, authors don't do very good from Amazon. So I offer signed copies. All the copies are signed. So if you get them from me, it's a little bit more. There you go, right? If you get them from me, it's a little bit more, but they're all signed. So so get your signed copy there, and I can assure you, like you said, if you enjoy the stuff that we've been talking about, my books are right up your alley, and I'm really happy with part 2. I mean, I like part 1, but I'm really happy with part 2.
Now that I've wrapped up part 1 a few weeks ago, when we've done this interview, I'll be placing my order for part 2 probably immediately.
Awesome.
And I can't wait to get into that one. In the meantime, I'm going to continue to enjoy your website.
Thank you.
You do have a very small monthly subscription. It's like $4.95.
Yeah, $4.95 a month or $60 a year. Yeah, and then you get access to all the archives and all that. And then I do a lot of tutoring now too on Patreon. So if people want to schedule tutoring, they can go to the Patreon or just message me and set up tutoring sessions. I have a question for you. So
sure.
So when you read part 1, what movie that I covered did you watch that kind of like that you saw in a totally new way, or was there one?
Definitely Legend was one that because I saw it as a goofy, fun movie, and then you made it real dark. I'm like, damn it. E.T. you cover. I didn't have many questions on E.T. But that was a fun, movie as a kid. Mainly the ones you covered that I grew up with.
Right. Those usually are the ones that kind of freak people out in a way. It's like, whoa, that's weird. I didn't know that was.
Let me see. Neverending Story. Another one I saw as a kid.
Yeah.
I would have never seen the stuff you talk about if you never brought this up. Blade Runner, of course, one of my favorites. I went back and watched it again. And then when the new one came out, watched it considering everything that I read before. And the new one, I'm like, boom, I'm just picking this stuff up like immediately. I'm like, Jay pointed this out, Jay pointed this out. And The wife hates watching movies with me now. She's like, "Can we just watch the movie?" I'm like, "No, this is going on. You got to pay attention here." And the Bond stuff. I didn't watch any of the Sean Connery ones until I started reading your work, and I go back and watch it. And I'm like, "Holy crap!" And again, pointing all these things out, and the wife's like, "We can't watch movies anymore. I'm done with you." So you've ruined movie night for me. Have you on your site? I've not seen it. No, you say in part 2 you're doing the Matrix, right?
Yes, I did do the Matrix.
That's got to be probably one of your most requested too, isn't it? The Matrix.
It was. I mean, I wrote that analysis maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it actually went viral. When I wrote it, I think it went. I lost track of how many views it had gotten. So actually, what I did when I put it in the book was I wrote more. I expanded it, rewrote it, kind of revised it, remastered it. So it is it's beefed up. It's not the exact same one. And I do talk about part 2 and part 3, which I didn't cover in the original essay. But yes, the Matrix is in here, and it turned out good. If you saw the TV show, the episode that we did on the Matrix for Hollywood Decoded, it's a lot of the same type of material. Because when I wrote the notes for the Hollywood Decoded show, it was based on a lot of what I put in the book.
Yeah. And I think you have a 15-20 minute video breaking it down too.
No, not yet.
I thought
I did a live stream, but I need to actually go back, and I'm going to do a 15-20 minute. I'm actually going to do a 15-20. My goal is to do a 15-20 minute high quality type of video like I've been doing for all of them. Because the live streams are fun, but actually the YouTube won't promote the live stream like they will in the algorithm, a 15-20 minute high quality video.
But again, you're like you were saying there, you do offer tutor sessions.
Correct.
And I can give you a ringing endorsement. We've had multiple talks on. I'm trying to get into philosophy. Get smarter. Nice. Jay has been a tremendous help.
Cool.
Helped me understand things on a much deeper level, question my own presuppositions, completely helped me gain a little more consistency in my own worldview. So I thank you for that. And anybody else who wants that, or geopolitics, theology, movies, all those things, hit Jay up on his site, Patreon. And unless you have anything else, I'm going to let you go. We've been going for almost 2 hours.
Also, subscribe. If you're watching this on the Jay's Analysis channel, be sure and subscribe to, what's your channel's name? I'll have it linked below, but.
Okay. It's a Jessam Guys podcast.
Okay, so I want to tell everybody to subscribe to his channel. And if you're watching this on his channel, subscribe to my channel. So I'm trying to grow my YouTube. We're almost at 40K.
I'm going to send all 5 of my viewers right to you. Right
well, but you might have people watching this 10 years from now when you've got 100,000 subscribers or 1 million subscribers.
We'll see, hopefully. Again, I very much appreciate your time. Thank you for doing this for me.
Absolutely.
Hopefully I get to talk to you maybe after I read part 2, ask you some questions again about part 2, have you on.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And then until the next time I need to have a tutor sesh.
Okay.
I'll talk to you later. Appreciate it.
You bet.